Hey everybody, and welcome to the first episode in a series I'll be posting called Religious Review. This series will be a rudimentary and shortened breakdown of common topics, misconceptions, and confusion on incorrect information in regards to religious discussions that pique my interest, or simply my perceptions on common religious discussions that are going on at the moment. I'll also occasionally have a religious rant episode where I might express my personal opinions regarding an associated topic that is a bit more tricky. It may be common beliefs or just religious actions and events of the modern age. Everything said in these videos are from my own personal research or experience, unless referenced or quoted. I'll try my best to keep these professional while still expressing the important points being made in each episode. Much, if not all, of the background footage for these talks will also be gaming footage of myself or someone who has sent me gaming footage. It's usually unrelated to the topic at hand, so feel free to set this device off to the side and just listen along as you do whatever work you're needing to do. If you have any topics you'd like for me to talk about, or if anything in this video is something which you have opinions on, feel free to comment below and debate it out. As always, I am an ardent supporter of the individual right to freedom of expression and speech, so feel free to express yourself and your opinions down below. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get right into it. Also, I would like to apologize in advance if you hear me sniffling at all, or if you hear anything in the background. I'm currently going down with some of the sinus problems that afflict a lot of people in my area during this time of year. We're going from spring into summer here in the South in the United States, and as a result, that has led from everything to torrential downpours and rainstorms to pollen being everywhere in the air, and it's just made me sniffly as hell. So nothing that can be done about that. You might hear some sniffling. You might even hear my voice crack here or there. I'll try to fix those whenever I get the chance. But otherwise, my apologies on that. As for background noise, as I've said before in previous videos, I'm a stay-at-home father, so I do these videos while also taking care of my children. You might hear them in the background watching TV or something. I'm in the process of updating all my equipment so I can make these videos a little more professional, but at the moment I'm currently using a cheap microphone I got from Goodwill, because thrifting is fun. So the pickup is very bad and there is very little background removal on it. But when I get a better mic setup for the computer as comparison to my camera setup, it'll be a little bit better on what noises it actually catches. So thank you for watching, and like I said a moment ago, let's just go ahead and get right into everything. Alright, so to get this started, let's cover what this video is actually going to be pertaining to, what the actual meat and potatoes of this video is going to be. So, you all saw the title of the video when you clicked on it, so it shouldn't be too much of a surprise, but the topic of today's discussion is an extremely hot item within the Christian mythosphere. The extremely old and fought about idea of the Christian Bible's interpretation around homosexuality, the act of being a gay person, and whether or not if it is considered a sin. Now, of course, this topic has been debated for a very long time already, so if you are familiar with this, don't expect anything of major significance from me, and I am the furthest from a professional theologian, so I'm not a priest who can tell you about the specifics about certain writing outside of what general academia and research can provide. So I'll try to include my various different versions of the Bible that I'm going to be referring to, including the Septuagint and the Tanakh in its original Old Hebrew. So before we get into the weeds of the discussion, though, let me stress a few important points here. So point number one, I'm not fluent in Koine Greek, Old Hebrew, Modern Hebrew, etc. I can speak some very weak conversational Modern Hebrew and read some Hebrew writing, but I'm not going to claim any kind of fluency on any of this. I know my letters. I know how to read some things. When I learned from my Jewish family how to do anything remotely Jewish, it was with Yiddish. And that was significantly easier because I grew up also learning German. So that's a bit easier on that regard. because of this, I am going to be utilizing translation services, and professionals will be quoted for any instances of a translation when necessary and possible, including any verification translations when apt. So, point two, this is, I just mentioned a moment ago. I grew up in a mixed religious household from multiple fronts. I am from a background of mixed religious, non practicing ethnic Jews, very actively Protestant Christians, and mostly unspoken about indigenous tribal spiritualism. So I was forced to go to multiple Protestant churches in my heyday, mostly being that of Southern Baptist and Pentecostal. I identify myself mostly being a-religious with a soft spot and closeness to my Jewish heritage, though I do follow in my deceased family's footsteps in adherence to diasporic Jewish traditions and celebrations, like during holidays and times of religious significance, though I'm not a strictly practicing Jew. I have I have attended temple a few times after asking permission to attend, but I'm not a member of any synagogue. I do like to watch and interact with the more modernized and live stream synagogues that function online, though, which is really interesting for anybody who is interested. I can't name off any specific ones off the top of my head. They're not always super regular, and they were more popular during COVID. So hopefully there are some that are still out there. I have not kept up with that very much as of recent, as much as I wish I would, but I haven't done that. I've been more focused on raising my children. So, point three, I will be using multiple translations of the New Testament in my points of discussion to cover as many bases as I can. Specifically, I am going to be using the most commonly used versions of the New Testament with some minor exceptions here or there. So that's like the New American Revised Bible. I know that's commonly used by Catholics. The English Standard Version, which is a general Protestant translation. The King James Version, potentially even the New King James Version to represent more American Protestant groups who still actively use that. I know the Mormons, for example, and Southern Baptists tend to revert towards the NKJV and KJV. And then the New World Translation, which is the Jehovah's Witness one. And the New International Version, which is commonly used by many of the non-denominational churches in the speaking world. Like I said, along with these, I'm also going to use the Septuagint because it's a Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is commonly used by the Orthodox world. It's in Koine Greek, so I will have to be using translationary services for that, as I do not speak Greek, Koine Greek, or anything of the sort. I did not grow up Orthodox. I have not attended any theologian schools to learn how to read Koine, and I'm not going to bother going through that just for a YouTube video. I'm an ignorant hillbilly. I'm not going to go that far. Point number four. So I am going to be coming from this and as unbiased as I can manage, like an unbiased point of view. This is, however, contrary to my personal beliefs as a non-Christian who is in support of the LGBT plus communities as it exists, and a member of said communities. I have to respect and admit publicly that this is the case. So as while I will attempt to keep this as unbiased as possible, I cannot make any guarantees that they might not slip through here or there. So please do take that into consideration. If you are a Christian watching this, I am not posting this as an attack on your beliefs or to discuss them in bad faith. I'm looking at this from an educational, academic perspective, where we absolutely must discuss both merits and conflicts within belief structures such as this. I would provide this exact same level of scrutiny to anything else, be they religious or not, were they the topics of discussion for myself, and I do not shy away from being critical over conflicts of interest. More on to this point, I should state that a lot of the points I will be making have been, allegedly, I should say, disputed and taken down by various other sources who are in favor of the opposite perspective, as how I am going to interpret it here. So if I state something that you have already seen a video on stating that it is incorrect information, please do still listen. You might learn a thing or two or see a perspective from my side of things. However, there have been lexicographologists or whatever they called. I'll correct this later in another mention down here when I go through this, but the people who actually research the exact specifications of words and lettering in ancient languages, some of them have disputed some of the claims that I will be making here. However, from what I've been able to find and see online, a lot of it literally comes down to them saying, well, it's so old and there's so many different references for it meaning this way or that we just have to rely on context clues, and we don't think the context clues mean the way that you think it's going to mean. So it could be a whole slew of different things we don't actually know. So this is my perspective on the discussion at hand, going through as much of the information that I can provide for y'all, using the information that I have outright from my own arguments and discussions with individuals of the Christian faith on this exact same very topic. Finally, I would like to take a second to go over some important details for people who are not familiar with the different things that I may have mentioned or are ill-informed about their specifics. If you want to skip ahead to when I begin the discussion on the actual topic itself, I will try to provide a timestamp on the screen right now to where you can skip to. Otherwise, allow me to explain some of the topics before we start. So, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, as I said earlier, in the Tanakh. It's the earliest known specific Greek translation of the books themselves, so a lot of people do consider them to be the closest to the original writings as possible, translated outside of Old Hebrew. So this would be a proverbial version of the Rosetta Stone when it comes to the Old Hebrew of the Old Testament of the Tanakh. So a lot of people do take it into consideration as being a pretty reliable source for this. However, there are some problems with this. So, you'll often see it sometimes listed as the translation of the 70 scholars or the 70 scribes. According to legend, in the Jewish faith, the pharaoh of Egypt named Ptolemy II Philadelphus sent 6 rabbis from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, which was 72 total rabbis, to Alexandria in Macedonia to translate the Torah into Greek so it could be included into the Library of Alexandria. In actuality, we know that some of the texts, including the laws of the faith, have been translated into Greek long before this alleged event. And being in the Library of Alexandria went the way, or being that the Library of Alexandria went the way of the Reichstag, we can only verify off the fragments and various remaining versions we have today, which date back as early as the 3rd century BC. So sometime in 300 to 200 range, which does match up with the lifetime of Ptolemy Philadelphus. So, lastly, what I wanted to cover here is the difference between the 2 versions of Hebrew. This is something that confuses a lot of people and must be addressed first before we get into the actual discussion at hand. This is very important. So the Old Testament, also known as the Tanakh, is written in a language called Old Hebrew. And Aramaic. There is another language that's called Aramaic that's very similar to Old Hebrew. They're both Old Semitic languages. They're both from the Levant, and they're both dead languages, meaning they have no native fluent speakers of either as of today. So, as a result, it's hard to directly know what each word means outside of scholarly study. So, Old Hebrew is not the same thing as Modern Hebrew. Modern Hebrew, also known as Revised Hebrew or Revived Hebrew, is a language created in the late 1800s and early 1900s by diasporic Jews as an everyday language, similar to how Yiddish had been used in the past. It was brought to Palestine through the Ottoman Aliyah, and or what is also known as the first return to the Holy Land by diasporic Jews, and it has since been the main spoken written language of Palestinian and Israeli Jews ever since. It's not the same thing as Old Hebrew, being a remade combination language utilizing modified Old Hebrew words, numerous loan words from various different languages, and new words created for the language to fill necessary gaps. Which was not put together in, which was put together in a 1908 dictionary, which was the main used dictionary for the language in its early history. You can't use Modern Hebrew to try and understand the writings which were done in Old Hebrew because there will be failures and faults there, which can be addressed later. I'm not sure if I will. We're just going to see when I get there, but you have to look at the old writings and the old laws from the Old Hebrew writing standard and how the language functioned as a whole back in the day. On top of this, and this is not something that I wrote in my script, but I'm going to include in here anyways, Old Hebrew as a language follows the same methodology as a lot of old languages back in the day, such as Sumerian, Akkadian, etc., other Levantine and Middle Eastern languages from the Fertile Crescent areas that originated from basically essentially creating a language that worked off of poeticism and rhyming so that it would be easier to operate and function with. But also, the way that it was used in everyday life back in the day would have been different from scholarly Hebrew, which is the written Old Hebrew, which is what we would actually see in the Old Testament. What would be written in the Old Testament, what would be written in the Tanakh, the Old Hebrew written in there is not the same as what would have been spoken, because the way it is written is specifically to come off as religious, scholarly, educated texts. The people who would have been able to read it back then are not the same people every day that would be going and buying bread or trading copper or anything of the sort. These would be read and written by scholars and ravs only, to be spread amongst scholars and ravs only, and read by scholars and ravs only. So when they would read it to everybody else during temple services and different holiday events, it would be done specifically in a way so that they would be essentially translating it to the spoken Hebrew for the people at the time. Or, we don't actually know if this is the case, it may have been read directly and meant to be taken in a poetic, very non-realistic stance. A lot of modern Jews do have this belief that a lot of the Old Testament that we actually read is essentially stories or fables, so that the stories themselves might be either exaggerations or outright falsified to create morals for the Jews of the past to have come to terms with and understood. Not in a sense of like, oh, the religion is fake and they were making up fake stories to make the Jews of the past afraid or scared, but rather an instance of they believed genuinely the religion was real, but they even would have known that the stories written were fake stories written to tell morals that God wanted you to believe as a member of his flock and as a member of his chosen people. So we're going to take many perspectives like that as we go through these readings, but for the most part, I do take a very literalist stance when it comes to the writings, because a lot of Christians nowadays take a very literalist stance when it comes to the Old Testament. If you ask many Protestant and I would wager Catholic as well, Christians in regards to the literalism of the Old Testament, many of them would say that it is meant to be as a history book, a literal text. And if that's the case, then we have to look at it from that perspective if we're going to discuss topics spread by modern day Christians and modern day Jews in regard to this topic at hand. So let's go from this into the introduction and get into the actual discussions of the matter outside of these points. So, for a good long while now, as many of us have, I've seen discussion online from people who claim to be Christians who discuss the age-old issue of whether or not if homosexuality itself is a sin within the confines of the Bible. I've seen it many times in my debates on different sites like Facebook or Reddit, and it comes usually to the point of a number of base points that get brought up. So, despite this, I have noticed that in modern Christian belief, it does tend to be an uncommon assertion that it is actually a sin, or that being gay makes you a sinner. Though this isn't by much, to be specific, according to a religious landscape study on the United States, or on a United States adults in 2023 to 2024, 59% of the self-affiliated religious believed that homosexuality should be accepted by society, while 49% who self-identified as religious believed that it shouldn't be on merit of it being sinful. This is noticeably higher than the years past and has been going up steadily as the years go by. More and more adults being raised in the modern age where homosexuality isn't as demonized by the social order. They're changing the views that are commonly held by religious people, especially Christians, in Western society like the United States, Europe, and etc. This specific study I found through Pew Research As always, the links to my sources I mentioned here will be provided in the video's description in a Google Doc for those interested. So, this has always led me to be curious about why exactly these folks are so deeply passionate about this, since from my own reading of the New Testament numerous times from my own childhood, and since becoming an adult, I have never really remembered any instances of the actual act of homosexuality itself being addressed directly. There was the obviously mentioned instances of sexual depravity, or the weird allusion to similar moral crimes, but nothing outright discussed the actual topics of homosexuality from my memory, having grown up being forced to go to the church, and specifically going to a church where we were forced, literally forced, to read the book all the time. I mean, I went so far in my childhood as to being part of the Awana Club, for anybody who might be familiar with what that is. It is a Protestant youth group, kind of like the Boy Scouts of America, but it's specifically the religious side of it. And I was a member of that my entire childhood until I inevitably left the church when my father no longer forced me to go. So I had a lot of time to read and memorize much of the Bible, and while I've forgotten many of the verses and I couldn't tell you them right off the top of my head for most of them, I can still tell you the generic stories as it goes on for the vast majority of the book, and even a lot of the conflicts and issues that were discussed during things like Awana Club and church. So it always baffled me a little bit to hear these claims, since I couldn't remember anything remotely close to this. So this led me down a pretty unfortunate rabbit hole where I collected numerous points and remarks from Christians who quoted me numerous Bible verses, told me about alleged Christian canonizations, and personal interpretation of other verses, which all culminated into a big mess that I had to sort out to properly weave together for this video as it stands. Like I mentioned already, I'm reading this off of a script besides going off script for minor things. As I said in a previous video, I don't usually script my videos, but I had to for this one specifically, because otherwise, between my ADHD and how messy of my notes were for this, I would go insane. So, yeah. I've already done all the heavy lifting on this. I will go ahead and go through the main talking points with subpoints addressed by others, which fit more neatly into the programming of the main topic. So, from there, we will go into the more detailed reasonings and explanations, contradictions and confusions around each claim, and rate its validity on a scale of truth under God himself to a solid "forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." The main points I were provided are the following. So, point one, the Bible itself directly denounces homosexuality as a sin and an abomination, detailing that those who commit those sin are unforgivable sexual deviants. The subpoint for this one being Leviticus 18:22, Leviticus 20:13, Romans 1:27, 1 Timothy 1:8 through 11, and Hebrews 13:4 being the most commonly quoted verses in regards to specific moments in the Bible about homosexuality, with the Matthew 5:17 stating that Jesus isn't abolishing the old laws but fulfilling them. Point two, the reason Jesus himself doesn't say the words homosexual is because it was so outlandishly bad and not done by anyone at the time that he didn't have to address it. Essentially, the period correct version of "don't exterminate all humanity." No one has to say it out loud because we all know inherently it's wrong. So I'll start from the most relevant and shortest point and then weave my ways into the final point, because these obviously collapse into one another to create the entire narrative as it stands. So to do this, I'm going to start with the final point on this. So to get to this point clear and done, since it doesn't require very much time at all, this claim makes so little sense whatsoever. I don't mean this from a literal perspective of it's always been around, but to be frank, it pretty much has. Homosexual involvement and interactions have been recorded and understood in human history for ages, spanning back long ago. We aren't really sure why it happens. What the point is in nature, I mean, as it goes against the end goal of genetic life, which is to infinitely reproduce and continue the gene pool, But what we absolutely do know is that it exists and has always existed. To my more science-friendly viewers, you might have heard similar instances, such as the belief that potentially the reason why homosexuality exists in animal life, especially mammal life, is because of the natural understanding of the equality of nature and overpopulation problems, as overpopulation can result in a mass death of a species. Some people do believe that the reason homosexuality exists in different life forms is because of the fact that it can be nature's way of not culling the species, but slimming it down over a long enough time period to prevent the mass destruction of that species because of the fact that we're not overpopulating. I don't know if that's true. It's always been something that's really been interesting to me, since we do know that, scientifically speaking, homosexuality and various other natural developments of the human body are true. They are real. This is not up for debate. It is absolute fact. So it is very interesting to see where this goes. But as I stated, we don't precisely know the actual reasoning. So it's just interesting to see the religious perspective on this, and with people stating that where Jesus didn't have to say the word homosexuality because it was so outlandishly bad does not make sense, because homosexual people did exist back then. Homosexuality as an act existed back then. Furthermore, we know that homosexuality was not only a thing, but prevalent enough during the years before, during, and after Jesus, that there have been entire studies covering this topic by professionals for quite some time now. When Jesus was alive around the year 6 to 33 CE, or 6 BCE to 33 CE, Judea was a province of the Roman Empire with 5 different provincial regions known as Judea, Idumea, Paramea, Samaria, and Galilee. As most know, the procurator of the Roman Judea during this time, for a lot of his life at least, was Pontius Pilate, or Pontius Pilate, as some people call him, who ensured that the area of controlled Judea was safe for Roman population, as well as safe from other Jewish revolts that have happened during the time. Sorry about that. My daughter woke up and was crying. So, during the time of Jesus, as he wandered through Judea, he was in constant contact with Romans, be they merchants, bankers, soldiers, tradesmen, so forth. He was pretty much always within walking distance or marching distance of a Roman citizen during the time that Rome controlled Judea, due to how Roman control over Judea worked. In Rome, for many centuries prior to Jesus' birth, the concept of gay relationships existed without much conflict. The Rome did not perceive homosexuality in the way we do today, and their limits to the act came from a system known today by folks as pederasty. Now, pederasty is mostly well known for being Greek or from Greece. I think pederasty itself, the name, comes from the Greek words themselves, but it's used today to refer to essentially when a adult male takes a young boy as a toy, if we'll say the most nice way to put it. And a ton of other countries had the exact same concept under different names. They might have even had localization names specific for that culture. So, Rome itself judged sexual interaction for much of its history through the idea of physical ownership, domination of others, and the social shame or humiliation. So, Roman men were expected to aspire for a certain level of masculinity in Roman culture, as many men today even are. There's basically no change there. What could emasculate a man in Rome, though, was to be dominated by another, usually in the form of like a military or political hazing by constituents or superiors. The one receiving was being humiliated by the one giving, creating a common social dynamic that existed for a long time in recorded Roman history. We know about this. It's written down. This is confirmable fact. There were exceptions to this shame, mostly from exempted groups who were by nature considered less than that of a full Roman male. So current and former slaves, prostitutes, non-citizens who had no rights or expectations of honor and humility. In these cases, it was still considered shameful to be the one dominated, but it was less notable than if two freeborn Romans were to be involved, which would necessitate knowledge over who was shamed by the other. This practice absolutely would have followed the Roman army to Judea, where Jesus was present, and this is indisputable of a fact. The combination of the Roman military's lust for glory and honor, along with a ripe population of people who were considered inferior, would create a free market of available lovers for these Roman soldiers who did not have access to women the vast majority of the time they were together in their armies. And this isn't even just to say it was desperate straight men, as there most certainly would have been individuals who, whether they knew it or not at the time, were gay men, and they suddenly were free to, as full citizens of the Roman Empire and soldiers, legionaries of the Roman military, would have the right and access to do pederasty should they want to. And as messed up as it doesn't even require pederasty to be a underage male as it's used commonly today in reference, as it was most commonly an underage male with an adult male. It could just be two men in a gay sexual relationship. This did exist, it was a thing. To question whether it would be present in the Jewish population is questionable, mainly due to the extreme nature of Jewish law around sexual involvement in general. So, Jewish tradition on sex before marriage was far more volatile than Rome's was, as it was considered a sin to commit even if you were the victim of a sexual crime. You were still the sinner as a participant, even if you're unwilling. The idea of any two people being sexually involved outside of a marriage was blasphemous to ancient Jews, and the Tanakh itself doesn't actually mention the specific words homosexual anywhere within the confines of the writing, as there is no actual word or wording that explicitly outlines the practice of homosexual involvement, though this will be delved into more later. And I should stress this because this is a common misconception by Christians who do not read their own book. There is no old Hebrew word that translates to homosexual or homosexuality. There is none. We have never found one or confirmed one, no matter how much research or in-depth knowledge we've put into the language via texts meant for religious purposes or non-religious purposes. There is never an instance of any situation where there is a word meant to refer to that in the Old Hebrew itself. This is a very big deal that needs to be addressed now, because like I said, I will delve into this more later. And this goes into the point with point number 2 that I was talking about. If it was such a problem and such a major deal that it was one of the worst moral sins you could commit, and Jesus did not require to mention it, why would you go so far as to not even make a word in your language to refer to this absolutely abysmal sin, were it to be one of the top sins in your book? Do you understand what I mean? So anyways, it's almost certain that Jesus would have been aware of the practice during his time, especially if he is this omnipotent physical body of the creator God, as many sects of Christianity perceive him as. Yet he doesn't feel the need to mention it once during his lifetime. Again, this goes back to the argument that he didn't say it, yes, but because it was so bad that it was a moral expectation and unnecessary to mention, I don't know. My main issue with this characterization of the teachings of Jesus is due to the fact that he mentions others very clearly, very obvious things that anyone today would consider exceptions that Jesus did still feel the need to mention. A perfect example being Matthew 5:21, where he reiterates the requirement of not murdering people. It's been mentioned numerous times already up to this point, yet he continues to push the matter, yet he remains silent on homosexuality. I find it highly unlikely this point holds any merit. It gets a firm "forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do" from me, simply because of this matter. Now, I have heard from some people in discussion where they break down a thing I'm going to mention later, which is the tiers of morality of what is and is not a forgived sin. in specifics referring to the Mosaic Law. I'll mention that more later. However, even in that remark, as we'll get to it later, I still do not think that if it was genuinely as bad as it's supposed to be, that Jesus wouldn't have mentioned it any time during his lifetime if it was something that needed to be reiterated. Because the biggest argument I've gotten from people is, so we should be allowed to murder then if the Mosaic laws don't apply anymore, because it wasn't mentioned, but it was. Jesus felt the need to reiterate that after fulfilling the old laws. So I don't see why we should go and still obey old rules from a book that he says doesn't apply anymore if he's not stating we need to apply to that rule anymore. He's already covering a ton of other laws. Why do we suddenly start throwing in laws he never mentions at all? If you understand my meaning. So, going on to the next one, this melds really well together, but in Matthew 5:17, Jesus affirms that he is not there to abolish the old laws of the prophets of Judaism, but to fulfill them. What that actually means depends on the person you talk to, the pastor you listen to, sometimes even which version of the Bible you actually read at all. So, I've heard countless times from people that Jesus' words here was meant to that he isn't abolishing the old laws, but fulfilling the requirements himself so they no longer apply to Christians who followed him. They use this as reasoning for why he then follows this statement up with the aforementioned statements that repeat rules that were part of the old laws of the Tanakh, like I mentioned. So, don't murder people, don't steal, love thy neighbor, all that jazz. This idea is that the rules that were in the Old Testament don't apply anymore to Christians except for what Jesus said himself. This is the justification that modern Christians use for why they don't have to obey many of the old laws. However, it is also a common belief among other sects that this was Jesus saying that he's not here to abolish the old laws, but to confirm that people following them will obey the laws that are to the letter, using a sort of a royal I, implying that his statement is that he will fulfill the law, is meaning that Christians as a whole will continue to obey all of the old laws. This is often used to justify the later quotes from Leviticus, but I noticed that most times this is said by people who actually live the other way, as mentioned, still doing whatever they want and disobeying the old laws themselves. They tend to follow the rules for thee and not for me, which that isn't to say there aren't Christians out there who are obeying all of the old laws. I'm sure there are some who follow the Tanakh to a T, but if they exist, they're an extremely small minority group. Delving into the actual verse, though, let's look at the wording across various translations, and then we'll compare them to what is happening here. I'll begin with the original Greek text, which was preserved in the oldest known renditions of Matthew. Mi nomesite oti elthon katalosai ton nonom I tos prophetas, eok elthon katalosai ola plerosai. Now, forgive my terrible pronunciations from here on, as I'm not exactly fluent in non-Germanic languages, but from here we can go to the other versions of this verse from my other translations as well. So, the New International Version says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." The English Standard Version, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." The New American Revised Bible, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. King James Version, "Think not that I come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." New World Translation, "Do not think I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I came not to destroy, but to fulfill." So far, we're off to a good start here. They seem to be in agreement in English about the translation with only minor shift, which means it likely went unchanged for a long time after being translated from the original Greek, or it was changed at the same time through history. Either way, from here we can notice some interesting facts that provide potential clues to the meaning of the verse. In all but two of the English translations, the Greek words katalasai is being translated as abolish, while every translation makes the word plerosai into fulfill. These aren't bad translations. They're pretty on point for the most part, but the words we get here become important for what their meanings can be. Even in English, the same word can have a multitude of different meanings whenever it's paired in different sentences. A lot of languages base themselves off of context clues. It's one of the most difficult parts about learning a language is understanding what word means what in what context. So, katalasai, for example, means to dissolve or to break down, but it's regularly used in older texts and the Bible verses to mean completely different things. So, in Matthew 26:61, it's used in the verse, "I am able to destroy the temple," using katalasai as a word meaning to destroy or obliterate in a violent manner, while Luke 19:7 sees it used in a verse that says, "He has gone to be the guest with," which in this specific meaning means to stay or remain. So being translated into "has gone" here, in Acts 5:39, the word is used to mean overthrow or take over, showing the point here even further. So, when it was translated, the scholars for this verse felt the correct variation of its phrasing was to say abolish, as in to get rid of. But that isn't the only possible translation of the word that fits within the sentence. If the phrase was actually meant to say, "Do not think I came to overthrow the law or the prophets, I came not to overthrow, but to fulfill," the phrase becomes sounds a lot less like someone who's discussing religious law and more so sounding like someone who's being accused of planning a revolt against the religious authority of Judea, which is something that Jesus was being accused of at the time. This continues with the word plerosai, which, while used a lot less than the previous word, it's used differently in different places and translates differently outright into the context used. Its normal usage means roughly to pay someone, as in like finishing a promise or a debt. It's used in other documents to refer to paying balances, and in the Bible itself, it's used 3 other times outside of Matthew 5:17. So, like in Matthew 3:15, it's translated also to fulfill in English, using context of filling people with righteousness, while Romans 15:13 follows suit with the "May the God of hope fill you with all joy and the peace as you trust in him," referring to the fulfillment or finishing of someone's spirit with the spiritual or hopeful. Lastly, Colossians 1:25 refers to the word differently, but in the same vein, translating it as completion, to complete, or to complete the word of God. So, knowing this, the reason for why we choose to say abolish and fulfill versus overthrow and complete seems pointless and menial until you consider how it does affect the actual understanding of the sentence. Someone telling you that they do not wish to abolish the law but to fulfill them sounds completely different to someone saying they don't want to overthrow the law but to complete them. Utilizing either of these interpretations opens avenues to different interpretations of what the verse is actually trying to mean. Someone saying Jesus came to end the old laws by fulfilling them himself and freeing his followers to obey his rules instead would point to the fact that the allusion to overthrowing the law has been a major point in Jesus' contention with the Sanhedrin of Jerusalem. It was the reason why they feared him so much. His influence threatened the religious order and rule of the elites of Israel. They could point to the potential use of complete to confirm that he had come to fulfill the law's requirements, or that he didn't come to fulfill the law's requirements, mind you, but to complete them himself, as if though they were unfinished and required finalization for his end goal of saving humanity from the oppressive thumb of the old ways. This matches up with the Christian belief that Jesus is God, so the only person who could fulfill the old law is the guy who made them in the first place, God. He would be completing the old law and removing his people from the old restrictions from his belief structure he set in place centuries prior. This pretty much gets confirmed too, by the way, in Hebrews 8:4-13, where in letters written to the Jewish Christians after the crucifixion, the writer affirms that Jesus meant he installed a new covenant to override the old covenant under Moses, and that the Old Testament laws and customs no longer applied to the Christian people. Someone on the opposite side could easily point to the official translations themselves, stating the exact opposite, as explained, showing that Jesus intended for the Old Testament rules to apply indefinitely, and that his life and death did not end the Christian requirement to follow the same rules and laws. They might say the same verse from Hebrews, as I mentioned, only applied explicitly to the Mosaic laws, which detailed the moral requirements of ancient Jews and included the Ten Commandments, covering things like animal sacrifices and holidays to adhere to. Strangely enough, though, despite both claims having some merit, both conflict with the fact that Jesus still made his followers adhere to and obey all customs and holidays of the Jewish faith, and to this day Christians still obey many of the customs, like Passover, though it's now known in the modern age as Easter. So, I do have to admit, though, I find the last option to be the least plausible, as it were, simply on the fact that the Christian world has refused to abide by the old laws for centuries now, with little to real conflict or complaint from the official clergy. Even the Catholic Church disobeys these rules on the regular. If Jesus intended for you to obey the laws of the Old Testament, then you would have to follow the extremely strict regulations of the Jews found in Leviticus and Numbers. Let me give some examples. Leviticus 1-7 has the requirement of physical burnt offerings to God on a sacrificial altar. This would be considered barbaric paganism to modern Christians. Leviticus 23 says there is to be absolutely no work on holidays at all or the Sabbath. There is no exceptions. Jews know this as Shabbos or Shabbat, and it is where you are to rest. So for Jews, it's Saturday, because Saturday was the original final day of the week in the Old Testament. On Saturdays, Jews are not to work per the laws of the book. In Leviticus 11-17, there's restrictions on the animals you're allowed to eat. Like, everyone knows about not eating pigs, yes, but you're also not allowed to eat any water creatures that lack both fins and scales. So, and you can only eat land animals with divided hooves and that chew their cud, meaning you can't eat rabbit, pig, squirrel, turkey, chicken, duck. Anything else with paws is a bird of any kind, any insects. I could go on for a while. Touching any of these dead animals also makes you a sinner until midnight, and you can't eat any of the meat with blood still in it, and you cannot consume blood itself in any form. This is a strict law per the Mosaic laws. Exodus 23:19. You cannot mix dairy products with meat products of any form. Some Jews take this to mean only of the same animal, but I mean, that still removes and ruins the entire concept of cheeseburgers. Leviticus 12, women who have had their periods or have just given birth are sinners and must wait 7 days after either to be purified enough to participate in the religion. Leviticus 15, physical problems causing irregular bladder issues is a sin. Anyone who has these issues is unclean and must wait 7 days before sacrificing 2 pigeons at an altar to God to beg for forgiveness. I mean, there's a ton. And this is when we get into the combination of the points here, being the quoted instances. The most common of these verses is the Leviticus rules. Leviticus is part of the Mosaic laws mentioned above, given to Moses by God, which all Jews are required to obey under the threat of eternal suffering and damnation and the loss of God's grace. I've been sent this countless times by countless people to justify the sinfulness of homosexuality, particularly in question Leviticus 20:13 and Leviticus 18:22. Before I even delve into the point 1 problems, I want to stress the issue here right out of the gate in regards to point 2. If Jesus ended the Mosaic laws, as both sides generally agree, then nothing written in Leviticus matters. Since Jesus ended the Mosaic law at the absolute minimum per the writings of the post-death Christians in regards to these beliefs and teachings, there is no Mosaic law left. Now, as I said earlier, I will address this. I have been told by some Christians that there is a tier list, that the Mosaic laws weren't fully gotten rid of, only the ones that are considered barbarism, and that there are different kinds of rules and restrictions, and that there's a set of what are known as moral laws, then financial laws, or sometimes just general laws. And like those are the laws of the country of Israel, the country of Judea, and then finally the food restriction laws. Now, this isn't written anywhere in the book. This is fan fiction made up by Christians. They get the idea of this from, I forget the text. I'll put it on the screen if I can remember the actual verse. But there is a verse in the New Testament where one of the apostles outright states that he got a vision from God out of the blue that told him, hey, you can eat whatever you want now. And that because that was said as a prophecy to that apostle, then there's a tier list to the rules, and the moral rules still apply, and that he only got rid of the general rules and the rules of the food restrictions and the clothing restrictions, because there are clothing restrictions, which that makes zero sense. As I stated, it makes absolutely no sense why there would be this tier list. It's not said anywhere in the New Testament or the Old Testament. That's not a thing. It's not. The rules do have some moral grandstanding to them. They do have some moral background to them, but it's religious law. All of the laws stated there are religious in nature and moralish in nature. When God says, thou shalt not wear clothing of two fabrics, he's not stating that there's a general reason, like, oh, you're going to burn up to death in the desert because you're wearing polyester and cotton together. No, it's God telling you, if you do this, I will smite you to death. If you want to live in my eternal kingdom, you will not obey these rules. And I've also heard from some people state, which this is partially true, that the Mosaic Law only applied to the Jews anyways, because the Mosaic Law is explicitly stated by God to be the laws of the nation of Israel where he led as hegemon king. The king of Israel was not a human king, but God the Father himself. And if that's the case, then there's absolutely no reason why the Christians would have to obey these laws to begin with, and that may be what Jesus is meaning here. But even if that's the case, the Mosaic laws don't matter in totality, meaning that what Jesus is saying here is that Leviticus is wiped from existence. It's wiped. You cannot prove the existence of the exception to moral laws, as some Christians state, because it's not written anywhere. It is strictly fan fiction created by certain priests and pastors and Catholic clergy throughout the ages to justify utilizing these verses in the modern age. And it does get a little bit messy here, because there is an instance that I'm going to bring up in a minute, which causes some problems in regards to how this is perceived, because there's some New Testament references towards homosexuality as well, which I have problems with personally. And while I'm not telling a Christian to discount what their book says, I am going to address some problems with these verses and explain why I'm stressing on the Old Testament ones here, mainly because the people who are talking bad about homosexuality from a Christian perspective are not mentioning the writings of the Apostle Paul. They are instead mentioning Leviticus. So I will be covering Leviticus now, but I will make sure before I end this to refer to the letters of Paul and the problems there. So, where was I? However, if Jesus didn't end the Mosaic laws, then precisely what was the point of all the references of him doing exactly that throughout the text? I'm sure I don't have to explain that issue here, so. But to get into the actual meat of this discussion and the most interesting debate for this entire conversation, as I've heard, there is a heavy debate around the actual wording of the English translations in regards to the quoted scriptures and whether or not if they would even be considered applicable to the argument of homosexuality being forbidden or a sin under Christian or Jewish beliefs. So let's get into that. So first, let's start with the biggest one, Leviticus 20:13. The most common quoted verse in regards to homosexuality. To quote the King James Version here, just as a base example, if a man also lie with mankind, as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They surely shall be put to death, their blood shall be upon them. You'll see the beginning of the phrase translating to something akin of, if a man were to lie with another man, rather than with mankind, which is the King James Version explained here, but most will say if a man were to lie with another man. That is the most common translation with other English texts. So allow me to explain the conflicts here. Leviticus 20:13 is the Old Testament, part of the Mosaic Laws, which I had mentioned, which was originally written in the Old Hebrew. So the actual words of the original text, as such, though do pardon my horrible pronunciation again, is thus:
ואיש אשר ישכב את זכר משכבה אישה תועבה אסור שניכם מות יומתו תניכם פעם.
The interesting part for the wording here, or the interest here is the wording, I should say, and the decisions of the translation staff in the movement from Hebrew to English over various translations. So, specifically, we will turn and look at the words used for man or mankind here. In the beginning of the verse, the words used in reference towards men is we'ish, which is written as wav, aleph, yod, and shin. Now, making up the two distinct Hebrew words, which is ish and wa means to be or to cause, and it's part of the verbiage of the Tetragrammaton, of God's chosen name, actually. Often spoken by Christians as Yahweh, if you've heard that. I know some refer to it as Jehovah, but Ish, however, though, is the important bit here. That means man. Ish is the simplest, most direct form of identifying men as a distinct biological entity, as it was used exclusively in reference to men and manhood, notably unused for instances of like unmanly individuals, angelic beings, God, younger boys, slaves. It meant a grown adult male being. So that actually I should state off script for a second. The old Hebrew language has a serious issue with having a dozen different words to use in reference towards various different meanings here or there, and it's a very important distinction to consider. So, like for example, like I was stating, the word ish, meaning man. So, ish is the most common, like I stated. However, if you were to read through the Old Testament, in the very beginning, when there's a reference towards the creation of mankind, they don't say in the Old Hebrew, ish for, like, mankind. Like, God created man. God did not create ish. He created Adam, which, if you take the words from that make up Adam, it means something like earth's blood, if I remember correctly. And Adama, meaning males, females. It's humanity in general, but it's also a person. Adam, Adama. It's the name of Adam, the first man created. So then there's Givir. Givir. It technically translates from, like, I think the words that make it up is like mighty and warrior, but it translates to soldier, or essentially it refers to mankind in a specific war sense. Enosh is another one. Enosh means mortal kind or mortal man, referring to humans in separation from creations of God, like angels, or even things like demons and fallen angels, the Watchers. And then you'll also see things like bin Adam. Bin Adam is a reference used to refer to mankind as well, literally translating to sons of Adam, or sons of Adama, meaning the sons of mankind. So these are instances of importance when you're learning about what the Old Hebrew words for man are, and noting the use cases of the specific words. And I'm sorry for this cut here, but it was important to bring up because there's even more words that are not mentioned here, which can refer to men, or specifically various specific iterations of mankind. So boy, girl, child, woman, wife, etc. will all have their own specific words, including numerous words per English term. So we're going to go into that. So back to the original. After this, we get into another word that is used to mean man in the translation, zachar, written as nun, kaf, and resh. So the word is more tricky. being used for various reasons across the text. In Genesis 1:27, it's used as a secondary word for male, where the sentence in Hebrew says, "And God created the man," using the Hebrew word cha'adim, and then saying He created them male, using zachar. So this implies that the word doesn't mean men, but the entirety of all males, regardless of stature, be they adult, child, feminine, masculine, doesn't matter. In this case, for cha'adim and zachar used in the same sentence, it's referring to God created Adam, He created the man, and He created him male. He created him zachar. He created him as in of men. But this gets weirdly interesting, though, when we consider other verses such as Genesis 17. The descriptions in Genesis 17, detail the sections and process for circumcision of the men of Judaism. In this, the word zachar is used in reference to younger boys, specifically the phrase "every boy among the men of the house of Abraham" from 1723. The phrase from 1710, "every boy among you shall be circumcised," and then the phrase from 1712, "every boy of 8 days among you shall be circumcised." There's also, "the animals you choose must be a year-old boy without defects, and you must take them from the sheep or goats," from Exodus 12:5. "All the boys among the sons of Aaron may eat it," in Leviticus 6:18. And then, "a woman who becomes pregnant and gives birth to a boy will be ritually unclean for 7 days," from Leviticus 12:2. So another instance from Leviticus. Now, someone could easily state the reasonings for this usage of zachar over wa'ish is poetic license. As I stated earlier, Hebrew is a poetic language, and some extremely old and lost writing techniques of Hebrew that have been forgotten for the ages and ages ago does show poeticism used in the language when writing. And there is validity to that argument. One could absolutely hold the thought and be valid. That being said, this is being brought up because there's more that holds to it than just this. It holds weight when you listen to it a little bit further. The bigger verse about this topic that is brought up lies in the verses of Leviticus 18:22. A couple chapters before that of the 2013, this verse shares the exact issues with 2013, specifically in its usage of the word zachar. The verse is most common, or in its most common forms of the translation, says something close to, "And you shall not lie with a man as you lie with a woman, for it is an abomination."
ואת זכר לא תשכב משכבה אישה טועה בה היא.
The word man used here is zachar, as seen here in the text. This is important because the word for woman is isha, as opposed to the Hebrew man, or wa'ish, or the opposite, I should say, word for Hebrew for men, which is wa'ish, as I mentioned earlier in regards to 2013. You cannot make the argument of poetic requirement here when there is no use for the word wa'ish in the verse itself. It immediately defaults to the word zachar for who should not be slept with if one sleeps with a woman. But the text shows no problem in using the phrase isha, which specifically translates to an adult woman or a married woman who you would actually be sleeping with. And I should specify, this is important because of the fact that in the way that the texts were written back in the day by the ancient Jews, there are numerous texts in the translation. There are numerous verses where God does not make a distinction between taking wives of children as they do of adults, and there is no age requirement for when a man can sleep with a woman as it's written in the Old Testament. So God does not care if a man takes from spoils of war a 3-year-old as his wife, who he would be legally allowed to sleep with. But for some reason, in Leviticus 18:22, they specifically use the word ishsa, meaning an adult woman, as someone who is to be compared to as how you would lie with. So if zachar was being used in the case of all men in general, why would they not use as well the term for all women? It would make more sense. Rather than using the term specifically for isha, for adult women, They could have used a term to refer to all women because it would have made more sense for the writings. And we can't state that, oh well, this was just an incident of, like, they would know better or something of the sort. You need to consider that when these books were written, paper, papyrus, all of this stuff was extremely expensive. Writing was a very uncommon thing. The person who wrote these texts down to be passed down from generation to generation would have been the tribes of Israel's smartest scholars, the ones who knew how to read and write, who knew the language and knew what to write. There is no reason why they would have made a mistake such as this when writing the text, especially when you consider that most people think that the Old Testament is the uninterrupted word of God. So why would God, if he is the one who ordered the writing of this text and told them what to write, why would he tell them to use the word in Old Hebrew for adult women in this case if they're not trying to make specification towards ages as well as genders here? Now, I would not put too much credence against the idea that ancient Jews were homophobic, because, as I stated, they were extremely sex repressed as a group of people. They didn't want any sex before marriage. It was a vehement sin. And as I stated earlier, it makes specific inference in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that if you are even raped as a woman, then you suffer the consequences of being a sinner, even though you could not control the fact that you had sex before marriage. So it makes little sense why they would make specification towards a specific type of sex here to be a abomination when there are numerous other writings in the text that simply refer to any and all sexual depravity, which we know in the Old Testament just means any sex that goes against the rules and issuance of God himself, which was to say, thou shalt not have sex until marriage, when a man and a woman were to get married, because this is an actual correct statement from the book. It does state a man and a woman are to be married, which makes sense. Biologically speaking, people want to reproduce, they want to continue making babies, they want to continue the bloodline. You cannot do that in a gay relationship, especially in the freaking Stone Age. That was a bit rude. They were probably in the Copper Age. But it makes sense. There's no IVF back then. So sexual depravity was any sexual contact by a man with anybody, or a woman with anybody, prior to them being married, and that would be considered sinful. So unless there was some form of acceptable marriage between two men back then it would be, as I stated, a sin under the name of God. He wouldn't be okay with it if they weren't married. And we also have to consider the fact that the statements of sexual contact prior to marriage, the translations are a bit iffy. I've tried to go through them myself. I didn't include them in here, but I'll quickly address them. There's not even really much in the way of stating that sexual contact with other people after marriage is necessarily explicitly wrong outside of adultery, but even then, it depends on what you would be considering adultery in this regard, because there's instances such as, I should say, in Roman culture, for example, where adultery, because of the way marriage operated in Roman culture, Rome did not marry for love. They married for political status, and because men died very quickly, and women would use this to inherit the household and to spread the genetics. So it was not uncommon for Roman men and women after marriage to take second wives, quote unquote, or mistresses and eunuchs. A lot of Roman women would take eunuchs, and the Bible, both the Old and New Testament, mentions eunuchs in this use case, and it seems to, from the text writing, that God does not see them as punished by any form of ruling because of the way they are used. And this has even led to some people believing that the term eunuch in the Old Testament is actually meaning gay men, and this is because gay men were not sexually attracted to women in the same way, and so they might be perceived as a way for men to get off without spilling their seed on the ground, which is a sin per Leviticus, or as a way to get off without cheating on their wives with another woman, which would be a form of adultery. So it's a whole other topic, but it's an important topic to consider simply due to this fact that we have in front of us that is not addressed nearly enough. So we get left with this situation of understanding why the words were used in this case, what the meaning could have been here. And I'm going to get back to the main point now, but that was something that I did not see mentioned nearly enough. So, 2 chapters later, the book explicitly uses the generalized word for adult men as wa'ish for the people who shouldn't be doing an abominable sin. So, this is important as well, considering the fact that a lot of people consider all homosexuality to be an abomination following Leviticus. If you were to consider that and think that Leviticus is active, now you have to take into consideration the word case here. It's saying wa'ish, as in adult men, should not be sleeping with, presumably, other men like they do with women. It doesn't state in the Old Testament women should not do sleep with other women as they do with men. There is some mentions in the New Testament, I believe, where it states that women became or got abominable thoughts and lusted after each other as men do, or something. I don't remember the exact ones. I might throw it up on the screen right now if I can find it. There might even be some mentions in the Old Testament I'm missing here and forgetting. I read through the book about twice trying to find everything I could, as well as doing online research here, so forgive some failures on my part here or there. But anyways, wa'ish is for the people who shouldn't be doing this abominable sin, but when referring to the target of sin, it refuses to use any other word other than zachar, a word which continuously is used across the Old Testament and other Jewish texts of the time period of the language it was used in reference to other things. So this shows very clearly that the writers were meaning something specific with their word choices. When writing the documents, especially when you consider that during this time it was extremely hard and time-consuming to write the original documents, as literacy was an extremely uncommon skill for the most part in early Jewish history, as I mentioned. The people scribing these texts would have been ravs of the priestly order themselves, who would absolutely know what they were behind, or what the meanings behind each word were written down, presumably. They have no reason to flip-flop around the words that were used and their using of the meanings. So, now that we've looked at the Hebrew of these 2 verses of the Old Testament, now let's look at the translation examples. To be frank, the vast majority of the translations are linked back to the Septuagint, so I'm going to start there. So Leviticus 18:22 in the Greek of the Septuagint comes out as such.
Kai meta arsenos oi koi mitisi, koiten gianakos deligme gareisten.
Now let's dissect the translations chosen here. This shows that the translators were already either in the camp of it meaning homosexuality, or potentially they themselves were confused about the Greek as they were as we see the use of the word arsenos in the translation of zachar. So, arsenos is a form of the Greek word arson, which means males as a whole concept. So, this is best seen in comparison to Genesis 17:23, as I pointed out prior, in the Hebrew comparison. In Hebrew, as we saw, Genesis 17:23 uses the word zachar, meaning the descendants of the house of Abraham, sorry. Taken to mean the boys by some. However, instead of using arsenos, it instead uses the word arson. Meanwhile, the use of the word bin aseh to mean among the men in the same verse translates by the scribes into andron, which is the Greek word meaning a specific room within a house where women were forbidden to enter, as an opposite to the Greek gyneceum, which was the women's room. In Greek, in Genesis 17:23, would seek to interpret the verse stating something along the lines of every boy among the men of the house of Abraham, instead to every male in the men's room of the house, a physical house of Abraham. I have difficulties believing that this was the intention of the original authors in Hebrew due to the lack of such a system of isolated gender based movement through Jewish households in such a manner as the Greeks. And the reference to the house of Abraham is clearly confirmed in other verses to mean those descended from Abraham's progeny, not being the actual physical house owned by Abraham, who's long dead by this point. To better see the Greek translator's intentions, let's go to another one. So Leviticus 20:13 in Greek comes out as this.
Kai os en koimiti meta arsenos koiten gianakios emphoiteroi anathematis thanotai en amati afton I anama aftan ep aftos.
Note a major difference in the actual translations here. Something which has been accepted as an acceptable change by those who utilize the Septuagint. The entire first part of this verse, We'ish Aser Yiskab, translates to a man who lies with. It's replaced instead with the phrase Kai os en komiti meta, which translates to and whoever sleeps with. This is a huge problem, as it directly removes the explicit written descriptor of an adult man, or a member of adult society of Judaism, being prevented from going down this path. It changes to an understanding of, or it changes it to an understanding of the reader. This is likely due to the fact that women were generally unable to read at the time this was translated, so the translators assumed that the person reading the book was a man themselves, but it revokes our ability to see how the Greek translators would have handled the We'ish and Zachar issue that arises from this. Instead, we see Zachar once again translated to Arsenos. This proves a major issue when considering how many different translations of the Bible into English rely on the Septuagint as a basis to work with, because they remove our ability to see what they would have translated We'ish into to refer to in opposition of Zachar. Would they have used the term arsenos for both, or would they have only used arsenos for Zachar and something else with We'ish? We'ish does not translate to mankind, as I stated before, and showed with the other inferences and references. Mankind is ben Adam, or Adama, or other old Hebrew words like that, meaning all men, or all of mankind, all of humanity. But they translated We'ish, which specifically means adult male human beings, into whoever or whosoever, meaning everybody. That is an incorrect translation there. This is when we begin to open up the New Testament and its interpretation of the rules in its own languages. Now, to be completely forward here, I am considering the New Testament texts at face value from a historical point of view, basing their age and origin languages from the oldest versions of the documents that we have. This is important because despite the fact that during the life of Jesus, the most common language in Judea was Aramaic, pretty much every book in the Christian Bible is written, though, in Koine Greek, due to the authors being decades or centuries after the death of Jesus and his disciples, and being part of different Greek churches that had popped up across the Levant and Eastern Roman Empire. Alright, so in the New Testament, there are three main verses that get quoted in reference to homosexuality being a sin. This is Hebrews 13:4, Romans 1:27, and 1 Timothy 1, 8 through 11. So, for context for these verses, it's absolutely important. Allow me to start with brief coverages of them. All of these texts are allegedly written letters by the apostle known as Paul, also known as Saul of Tyresis, I believe, to various people throughout his lifetime. Though many scholars do agree that we can't know for certain due to writing quirks not matching across each text. A good example being Colossians. It is attributed to the Apostle Paul. However, most biblical scholars do agree that it could not have been written by him due to a mixture of the age of the texts themselves as well as the writing style not matching anything he had written in his lifetime. So, First, let's go into Hebrews. Hebrews, as a book, is the letters directed towards early Christians who were being tempted to rejoin the Jewish faith after the death of Jesus due to fears of Jesus not being the Messiah. The author used quotes and passages from the Old Testament in the letter to try and convince them to not leave the faith and to hold fast to their beliefs in Jesus, the Son. Second, the book of Romans is letters Paul's are written, and his descriptions of his faith and affirmation of various beliefs around Jesus, as well as his decisions to preach to everyone and not just the Jews of the world like the other apostles mostly were. It also expresses concerns about the corruption of the people and his beliefs and the transformation of the individual through belief and the requirements of believers. This is a big reason why Paul is sometimes called Paul of the Gentiles or Paul Apostle of Gentiles, because of his specifications as a Roman citizen who was given this vision from God after being blinded by the light of the Holy Spirit. He was told to stop oppressing the Jews and the early Christians by the light of the now deceased Jesus. And from that moment, as a Roman, he decided to drop everything, convert completely, get baptized into Christianity, and begin his preaching and pastor work as a minister and an apostle under Jesus. Ironically enough, he's the only Jesus who never physically met, or he's the only apostle that never physically met Jesus during Jesus's physical lifetime. His only interaction with Jesus was the vision in the on the roadside when he was blinded by the soul or the spirit himself. So he's the only apostle of the apostles that was not physically there for Jesus's ministry. So, fun fact thrown in there. Um, Lastly, First Timothy is a letter written by Paul allegedly to the priest known as Timothy in the Greek city of Ephesus in what is now modern day Turkey. So he was giving him advice and tips on his preacher work and explaining how God's law must be pushed onto perceived sinners, which includes the sexually immoral. And it should be noted that the rules Paul makes in this letter are not directed to have come from God or Jesus, but rather from Paul himself and his restrictions in the ministry. It says it explicitly in the text that these were his rulings and his beliefs as an apostle of God. So it's important to understand that. So First Timothy is pretty easy to ignore, mainly due to the fact that it's not the word of Jesus or anyone who actually knew him directly anyway. And it also utilizes the Greek word of arsenokoitos, which is often translated as homosexual men, despite being hotly contested by linguistic experts. So anybody who speaks English, which you should be an English speaker if you're this far into the video, but you've probably heard the term coitus to refer as a term for sex or sexual activity that comes from Greek, because koitus or koitoi is the Greek word meaning bed or like where you would sleep. And arsenos or arsen, obviously, like I said, refers to all men, males, the physically male of mankind. So the word could translate to something along the lines of to be in bed with men, but it could also just translate to something as simple as a male in bed. And we don't specifically understand the meaning of what is trying to say with that, and the translation of it is very difficult. A lot of people will tell you outright that it's clearly obvious and that anybody with half a brain would understand it means homosexual men, but there's a lot that guys do in beds other than, being gay with one another. And for all we know, arsenokoitus could literally just mean promiscuous men, aka the sexually deviant, which would fit within the lines of what Paul had been speaking about for much of his time, where he referred to the sexually immoral. I state that it's pretty easy to ignore, and I feel like a lot of these are pretty easy to ignore. Just to cut in here, the issues that I have with Paul. I was going to say earlier that I was going to bring this up, and I'm going to bring this up now. As I stated, Paul is the only apostle to have never physically met Jesus in his lifetime. He got a single visit from God, or from Jesus, after his death as a spirit, and After that visit, he then decided that he was going to go and preach the word of God and Jesus as a Christian convert. The problem here is that the apostles of Jesus, the other apostles, the ones that stayed with him his entire life, they were there directly to see his physical impact and speech and then portray to others what Jesus wanted to be done in this lifetime under his direct tutelage. Paul did not get this experience. His experience and understanding of Christian theology comes from a single encounter with the Spirit of Jesus as a literal come to Jesus moment, combined with reading the writings of other Christian theologians at the time and hearing stories about the life of Jesus from people who witnessed it directly. So we cannot say for certain that what he says and what he interprets as being necessity and a sin would be considered by Jesus to be a sin himself. And this is a big deal because of the fact that when you look at the texts of other authors, they do not mention homosexuality nearly as often, if ever, depending on translation, as is mentioned by Paul. Paul mentions it a lot, an uncomfortably like an uncomfortable amount of times. And considering how many of the books of the New Testament are Paul's writings allegedly, this is an important distinction to consider, simply due to the fact that if one priest out of 12 of them is telling you being gay is wrong, well, the other 11 usually don't give a crap. What does that say about what the actual intentions behind the writings and belief structure of Jesus was? And I have had someone tell me that, oh, it makes sense because Paul was the only one who spoke with Gentiles, and Gentiles, as we know, had homosexuality already. So he had to stress to them that homosexuality was wrong because they might not know it any better. But Jews are where the majority of these apostles went to speak to, like Peter and so on. And so, since they spoke with Jews, Jews already didn't do homosexuality, so they didn't have to bring it up. And that's such a catch-22. It's such a catch-all for how to avoid explaining away the reasoning here, because Gentiles were preached to by more than just Paul. Paul was the one most known for speaking to Gentiles, but we have writings in the New Testament from other apostles where they spoke to and preached to Gentiles often. Not as often as Paul, at least not from what we can tell, because Paul wrote the most about Gentiles, but they did still speak with other Gentiles. Other apostles spoke with Gentiles, and they never needed to bring up homosexuality here. The few times that it is close to being mentioned, or is mentioned in an offhand way, like I said earlier, I believe there is a writing at some point in the New Testament where it mentions something about women lusting after one another in the way that men did with each other. Even those instances are rehashes and them mentioning old books of the Old Testament, stating things like that. And that's a pretty unfortunate circumstance when you have to consider whether or not if you can trust Paul's writings here. A Christian is going to tell you, yes, you can. And the big reason for that is because of the fact that it is canonically part of the Bible. When they created the canon and picked and chose which books of the Bible that the ancient Christians actually read and believed in were and were not part of the canon, they explicitly made Paul's canon because of an interaction between the Apostle Peter, I do believe, where he refers to the letters written by Paul as scripture. And so that is seen as giving divine authority to the writings of the Apostle Paul, because Peter knew Jesus directly, and if Peter is saying, oh, Paul's writings are other scriptures, then that's a man who knew Jesus stating that the scriptures of God himself are in the same tier as the writings of Paul, so people consider the writings of Paul as to be divine themselves, as if though they are the words of God and not Paul himself. I have issues with this. If you don't, then consider it however you want, and this might be considered a turning point for you. But it is an important instance to cover and understand, simply due to the fact that there is a lot of debate even amongst theologians, regarding the validity and truthfulness of Paul. The man even states in a few times in the writings of his letters that he is a trickster of a sort. He says statements such as, what's the exact statement? I'll put it on the screen if I can find the exact text, but it's something along the lines of like, "I have caught you in a falsehood. I have tricked you into belief," or something along those lines. He states a few times straight up that he weighs the options between the sinfulness of lying versus the righteousness of bringing people to God, and decides that him lying to bring people to God is valid if it means that they convert to Christianity. And it is essentially a instance for other Christians, telling them that it is perfectly right for them to lie about what's in the book and the belief structures if it brings people into Christianity. And if that's to be taken at face value as it is, and he's telling us that what he says isn't always true because it brings people into the faith, then how are we supposed to even believe what is and isn't actually true from what he believes is the rules towards what is actually believed by Jesus? And this is a thing that I've always had, a belief I've always had as someone who came from a Christian background myself. And one of the reasons why I didn't trust Christianity growing up is because of writings like that, instances like that, which makes you question whether or not if you can believe what you're being told. But to get back to the main thing, remember that the Septuagint, which dominated the reading of the Torah by non-Hebrew speakers, was already written and widely spread about 200 years before the life and death of Apostle Paul. Furthermore, Paul's writings were always in Greek rather than Hebrew or Aramaic, so it's entirely likely that his direct interpretation of the Tanakh was through the Septuagint translation, not the Old Hebrew. Due to Apostle Paul's secondhand understanding of Jesus' teachings and lack of affiliation to the man himself, as well as his preference towards an easily identifiable changed variation of the original text, his credibility on what it is and isn't permitted is held to scrutiny on this. It should be stated that Apostle Paul does have Jewish ancestry, which in the old method means that his mother was a Jew, as in the Jewish faith, you are only born a Jew if your mother is born a Jew. That's how I am ethnically Jewish. My mother was born Jewish, and her mother was born Jewish. It's matrilineal. My children are not born Jewish, even though I'm a Jewish man, because my wife is a Gentile. So, in the old ways, Apostle Paul's mom was a Jew, and he was born a Pharisee. However, his dad was a most likely Roman citizen, and Apostle Paul himself is described as being a Roman citizen and a Roman. So we can't say for certain whether or not if he understood Old Hebrew or knew how to read it, or if he knew Aramaic and how to speak it, because everything he writes and says is in Greek, and during his lifetime, Greek would have been the language he knew. So it's entirely likely that he didn't even know Hebrew or Aramaic and couldn't read the old book. And if that's the case, then his interpretations on what is and isn't wrong could come from the Septuagint, which I've already pointed out has its flaws. Now, Romans and Hebrews are less offensively direct with decisions, quoting the laws of the Old Testament in their mentions of sexual immorality, but failing to meet the requirements of affirmation due to the other textual statements saying these same laws lost favor after the sacrifice of Jesus during the crucifixion. This also still falls into the issue of the interpretations used by Paul in the writings being the Septuagint variations of the text, which, as I displayed a few times already and affirmed, they are flawed in their willful changing of the context and phrasing of the verses to accommodate the opinion being spread and shared by the translators in question. So, for example, I'll throw up onto a screen right now Romans 1:27 in Greek and Hebrews 13:4 in Greek. Okay, So, having gone over everything here as I did and reviewing the non English texts, this opens up a lot of confusion and questions about verses. More specifically, what are we supposed to believe to be the truth, and what is a change or a falsehood? So, I'm left with a few major questions, of which I can provide some smaller answers towards myself, and then I would like to end this video off with a few statements of my own. Please do consider that all of this is to be my perspective on things, and I could be very well wrong on this. So, question number one. Can we trust the translations of the text we have with a certain level of validity or accuracy? So, this is a question that predates the debate itself, but is insanely important for anyone wanting to hold true religious values about the Christian faith. To equate this to something more modern, this holds the same level of veracity as the subtitles versus dubbing question amongst fans of foreign television, especially Japanese anime. Japanese language purists will insist that you cannot get the actual genuine feel of the show unless you hear it in the original voice and inflection that the creators had in mind for the sentences, and you cannot truly understand everything said or written without viewing it through a Japanese lens. A good example of this is the infamous line found in many romance anime, where a man who is flirting with a girl under a bright night sky might say aloud, "The moon sure is beautiful tonight," often invoking a blush from the girl who he's with. We as Westerners cannot understand without foreknowledge that what he has just stated is the Japanese equivalent of calling a woman exceptionally beautiful. It comes from a phrasing written by a Japanese novelist named Natsume Soseki, where he criticized an English translator in the Meiji era for translating the phrase "I love you" too directly, stating that subtle reference to a woman's beauty and your feelings towards her is more Japanese. This is a cultural aspect of Japan that many, if not most Japanese, would know as native speakers of their language. Whenever we subtitle or dub the phrase, we're stuck with two options here. We can translate it directly to "I love you," which means the person reading the scene is unaware of the actual words stated and their cultural meaning, or we can translate it directly and potentially risk the person absorbing the words not understanding why the character would say those words in order. "The moon sure is beautiful tonight." When you translate books like the Bible from the original text into another language, you have to consider that these exact same issues. On top of this, we have to consider the failure points that exist along the path between the original writing and the version that we end up with by the end of the translation assembly line. On one hand, we hope and trust the people translating the verses know the languages that they're given, and that they're giving us an accurate, correct writing of the book. But we cannot say for certain that this is the case by the end. Looking back at the Septuagint, for example, in this comparison, I shared about the verse in Leviticus 20:13. The translator took it upon themselves to change the wording of a sentence to fit the narrative within Greek as he thought it was implying. A sentence, "a man who lies with, becoming, and whosoever sleeps with," is a major change of narrative. Even the translator did not think, or that even if the translator did not think so at the time. There is a much larger net difference between those sentences than one would assume, and the interpretation of what that sentence even means can drastically change during these changes in translation mistakes. This is important. This isn't the equivalent of translating the any novel, like dime store novel. This is the uninterrupted word of God. And if you're translating it incorrectly, you're changing the words of God himself per the belief structure of Judaism and Christianity. So to go so far as to decide that the sentence feels better or reads better or is interpreted better this way changes the opportunity of the reader to understand what is actually trying to be stated here. So my final thoughts about this, in consideration of the question of whether or not these verses are trustworthy, is entirely a personal one to you. My own opinion in regards to this is that you should be more worried about what the original words said over what the version in your own Bible is stating, because this isn't a scenario like a novel being translated. It's the Christian faith. The words in the Bible are the inspired words of God, like I said. Unless you believe that translation changes or alterations of the text are still the inspired words of God continued, then any mistakes and changes, alterations, or otherwise is a deviation from what God himself intended for you to hear as his people through the text of his book. I would be concerned with the validity of any statement written in English, Greek, or any translation if they differ from what the Hebrew or Greek of the original words were written. So for the Old Testament, I would specify an understanding of the Old Hebrew and looking into it yourself, not just trusting what your pastor or preacher tells you to believe, but actually looking into it yourself and seeing how things might be different from what you thought it was. And I know that there are some sects of Christianity, especially situations like the Jehovah's Witnesses, where it is literally part of the doctrine to not research your own book in favor of believing what the main government of that subsect believes. But the vast majority of Christians don't hold that level of restriction in regards to their people. You should strive to know better. And in the New Testament, I said the Old Testament just a second ago, the New Testament was in Greek, all of it, the whole thing. Not a single book of the New Testament was ever written in Old Hebrew. It was all in Koine Greek, and you can learn Koine Greek. I'm not telling you to go out and learn an entire new language, but translation services are free online with sections like Bible Hub, for example, lets you click on specific words in the Greek, and it'll pull up every single thing it could potentially mean, what the word translates to in other verses, so you can compare them for yourself. I especially, this isn't sponsored by Bible Hub, but I heavily recommend Bible Hub because they go above and beyond and out of their way to cover all these different variations of the Bible, Old and New Testament, and give you the ability to look at what the actual words would mean and what they could have meant based off of other instances used in the religious texts themselves. And there are some other online resources you can find where it'll even compare them to other books and texts written at the time period from other writings which aren't canon to the Bible. A good example, it's still a part of the Bible, but it wasn't canon for Christians, so Christians don't consider this to be canon to their storyline, except for the Ethiopian church, is First Enoch, which is a it's a book of the Bible, which it was refused canonicity when they were making the New Testament as one solid book for Christians to read. However, early Christians still read it, and it's actually referenced and quoted multiple times in the New Testament, so it is still a valid piece of writing. I do recommend people read it. It's the interesting one for any biblical conspiracy theorists that are watching. They're familiar with it because it's the one that brings up the Watchers and the whole concept of the Nephilim as the child, or the demonic children of fallen angels or abusive angels and the daughters of man. It's an interesting book, but it'll compare the writings and the words that you click on to even those books as well. So I definitely recommend you please look into it and actually take the time to understand what each of the verses means outside of just believing what someone else says. And that includes myself here. I do not intend for this video to be for someone to make their mind up in regards to what the book actually says based off of what I'm telling you. This is meant for me to point out flaws so that you are interpreting and understanding that you need to go and look for yourself. And even if you step away from this video and don't change your mind at all and still believe that, the Bible still doesn't like homosexuality, then so be it. I can't change your mind if you're that dead set on it. But if you at least walk away from this video with an intention to actually look into the texts and learn a bit more and get other perspectives, I would be greatly appreciative. So, question number 2. So does the Bible actually say homosexuality is a sin? Again, this can come around to your own personal interpretation in the end, as I said, but I will still state 2 main points about this as my answer personally. So point 1, as I stated already, the main perceived instances of homosexuality being considered a sin in the Bible, in the Old Testament's Mosaic laws, Jesus stated already in various verses and instances that he came to fulfill the old law, and whether you believe that means he got rid of the old requirements or not, it opens up a completely different can of worms. Whether you believe Christians should still obey food and clothing restrictions and altar sacrifices through rituals and ceremonies or not, those questions can come back to the viewer on what they believe is and isn't true. If Christians no longer have to obey these rules, however, and the requirements of the old law, then by nature the antagonism of sexual deviancy as described in the old law should no longer apply to Christians as well. Nowhere in the book did Jesus say that you could pick and choose which Leviticus laws to obey and which ones not to. Along with this, as I showed, the phrasing used by Jesus in his reference to the fulfillment of the Old Covenant has its own translation issues, which creates two narratives. Either Jesus being there not to end the old laws but to fulfill them, or that Jesus is not there to overthrow the old laws but to complete them and end them. One creates an interpretation where the old laws are still valid and Jesus is instructing us to follow them, and another where Jesus insists that he isn't a religious conqueror, but rather freeing his people from the oppressive covenant between God and Moses. Considering that the fact that barely any Christians today obey the covenant, I'm more inclined to believe the second option here than the first. Point number 2. Other than the previous point, as I stated already in the Old Testament, the phrasing of the Hebrew does give a valid reason to doubt the common English translations. Too many instances of vague words being used where more solid concrete words were available creates a situation of issue where the belief of Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 being in reference to pedophilia is far greater an option than many give it credit for. Considering the only reason these issues are addressed later in the New Testament is by an apostle who never met Jesus physically and was expressing his own views on what God wanted, we have to rely on the Old Testament verses to figure out the valid interpretation here. It's ultimately the choice of the reader on what they believe God is trying to say in these words, but from my own research and comparison of the text across various usages of the words, it seems to heavily imply that Leviticus counts were trying to be a Jewish law refusing Jews the opportunity to take part in the popular act of pederasty, which existed in numerous cultures by that point. My interpretation I take from this myself is that the phrases are about pederasty, and that this makes more sense if Jesus was trying to complete and end the Old Covenant, as their largest growing base of converts were from Romans, who would have either been victims or participants in the custom of pederasty, which was prevalent in Rome and other cultures of the time. There was no better way to gain converts than to remove restrictions on something that wasn't seen as problematic at the time compared to today. And we see that especially with the removal of circumcision as a requirement to be a Christian. Many Jews probably would have been all for not having to cut the ends of their penises off in order to be part of this new faith and religion. Ultimately, my perception of the words as they were originally written in the literal translations of the phrasing and words used, it seems to imply away from homosexuality and towards a condemnation of pedophilia. There are obvious flaws in this interpretation, but even if it were to refer to homosexuality, the laws and rules against it, which are set in rules all that by all accounts seem to be targeted by Jesus for disillusion, as he wished to make a far more open and less restrictive religious existence. Now, that does create a small problem that others have brought up to me in the past. If it's about pedophilia and pederasty, and Jesus got rid of those laws, is Jesus condoning pederasty? Which, let me be frank here, Jesus was alive during the time of the Roman Empire, trying to create a new faith to bring Gentiles and others who weren't just Jews to God, the Jewish God, the God of the Jewish people in Israel. And in order for him to attract these people, he would have needed to allow them to practice their sets of faiths and their beliefs and their cultural products and stuff, which may have gone directly against many of the Jewish beliefs at the time. And while it's certainly seen as wrong today to be a pedophile, and I do believe pedophilia is wrong, I'm very in favor of the wood chipper method of dealing with them because it is absolutely disgusting. It was not seen as bad back then. In this sense, pederasty was a common concept during the time, and if Jesus is telling Gentiles who may be vaguely familiar with the rules, or telling Jews who had been living with Gentiles for their entire lives under Roman rule, that the old laws, which were about pedophilia, no longer apply, that may be opening up the avenue for Jewish men to be involved in pederasty as well, or allowing Romans who were victims or participants, as I said, of pederasty themselves, the right to still be holy under God's light and seek forgiveness through the death of Jesus. And while it certainly is seen as wrong today, and I definitely think it is still wrong during the time period, considering the times that it was written and he was speaking, Personally, I think it was probably seen as a good thing, as messed up as that is. So ultimately, my perception of the words as they were originally written in the literal translations of the phrasing and words used, it obviously seems to imply away from homosexuality and towards the combination of pedophilia. As I stated, that's the first sentence of what I just said, and I want to reiterate that here. He wanted to create a far more open and less restrictive religious existence for Romans and for the Jews of the time. It makes sense. If it was the case, then, I mean, he did. And it probably did get a lot of converts. Question number 3. What is the takeaway from this video after all of this? So I'm going to be frank. I know I've said that a few times, but the takeaway I'm hoping people get from this is that when it comes to deciding your beliefs on situations, utilizing religious interpretation is extremely flawed in so many ways. The Old Testament contradicts itself so much throughout its writing, including having 2 separate origin myths in the very freaking first book of the Genesis itself. And even more contradictions expose themselves between the Old and New Testament on what is and isn't permitted or allowed, even down to the canonization of books making no sense. Like I said, the first major groups of Christians, when they came together and made the Bible and put it all together and chose what was canon, they did not consider First Enoch to be canon text of the Bible, even though it was quoted multiple times, especially in the book of Jude, verse 114. It directly quotes a prophecy from the text of First Enoch and quotes Enoch as the prophet who made that statement. That Jude 114 makes 0 sense unless you know about First Enoch, and it just seems like a one-off throwaway phrase unless you know about First Enoch. It should have been canon, but it's not. So if you have a reason to hold a belief, make sure it's thoroughly researched and understood. Christianity as it exists within the United States is ironically heavily reliant on trust and assumptions that you are being told the truth by your pastor, your congregation, and finally the version of the Bible that you're reading in the first place. Too many Christians won't stop and consider how much of a serious implication it is that there is so many different translations of the exact same book in the exact same language, oftentimes with completely different verses, phrasings, and translations of the exact same words. We exist in a day and age where translating the original text is not all that difficult, and understanding the text as it is written requires the same level of effort as biblical study in the first place. We no longer live in a day and age where you're severely limited on what you can and actually learn and understand, and what you can't. The world is at your fingertips, and all you need is the genuine drive to learn and better yourself, and your understanding of what it is that your interests are, and your religious drive and what drives you. I'm going to end this video off with a point that needs to be the capstone for this whole discussion. Like all discussions about this topic by others and by the professional theologians and lexicographers, our knowledge of the intent of those who wrote these pages generations ago is limited to what we can decipher through available texts and the meanings behind each word used. Of what I've stated here, it may be completely and factually true, or it's entirely possible that we might learn later on that I'm completely false here, and I'm willing to accept when I've been wrong. We have to work within the bounds of knowledge as we have it right now, and can't expect the absolute valid truth to always be existent and present ahead of us. I ask everyone who bothered to watch all the way through and hear me out, don't let this be the final discussion or investigation by the topic, or of the topic by you. There are far more perspectives on this from others who have been offering views on the topics as myself. I also ask that you look into it yourself. Please don't just delve into other people's pages. Go into the specifics so you can identify for yourself what you actually believe the authors of the Old and New Testaments meant with their words and word usage. This is just a single explanation perspective, a review of my own kind, and about a topic that has existed for a lot longer than many of our traceable family lineages can be found. There's a significantly larger span of complexity to this topic that cannot be definitively answered as a yes or no, and we have too little genuine information to decide as a whole society as to what is and isn't the explicit truth. Anybody who tells you that they know for a fact what the truth is lying to you, or way too full of themselves and what they believe. Everyone likes to think that they're right, but in the end, we're all making guesses as to regards what was written thousands of years ago. If you like this video or the discussions within it, please feel free to drop a like or a comment with any of the topics, ideas that you might want to see in the future. I have a lot of other planned videos already in the backlog awaiting a more in-depth investigation and discussion before they get funneled out into the channel. As always with my videos, I appreciate anyone who bothered to stick around to get to this point. Thank you for watching, and stay sane, America. Peace out.